Good afternoon, good evening, good day, wherever you may be. On behalf of the 1860 Heritage Center, myself, I'd like to thank the organizers for giving us the opportunity to present on a topic that is very under-researched throughout the diaspora in terms of indenture. I'd also like to thank the organizers and the sponsors, particularly Dr. Frazana Goundan, for giving us this opportunity. My topic is on child labor during the system of indentured labor to South Africa between the years 1860 to 1960, sorry. The revision, documentation, and teaching of marginalized history is crucial to the forging of a collective national identity in post-apartheid South Africa. And you would have seen with the unrest in the last few years that our identity as South Africans is under threat. So clearly, indenture studies forms a huge part of it, and we want to see it as part of the collective. So detailed studies of this wide-ranging topic of indentured worker history remains inadequate in many facets, simply because of where we've come from in terms of apartheid. One of the foremost scholars on indenture, this is in South Africa, the late Professor Surendra Bana, who did the study on the ship's list, and he did it between the years 1860 to 1907. So it wasn't a complete one, which includes up to 1911. He spoke of 75 linear meters of archival material that lies in wait of further research at the Pietermaritzburg archives. The Pietermaritzburg archives are in KwaZulu-Natal, and this is where all these documents are stored. The sheer volume of work, as he had pointed out, points to many gaps that exist in the fields of indenture studies that await serious scholarly attention. One of these gaps points to the socio-historical location of children in the system of indenture. Sumita Mukherjee, one of the few people that have written on child migrant labor in indenture, points that there's a huge scope that lies within the archives and in the field to explore the Indian child migrant as a historical subject in its own right. Here in South Africa, there were 384 ships that transported workers. 62% were men, 25% were women, and children constituted 13% of the total of 152,000 that arrived between 1860 and 1911. Children were clearly firmly entrenched as a vital part of this labor provision mechanism during the system of indenture. So where is this evidence and how do we validate child labor in the system of indenture here in South Africa? One particular example that's cited as far as the records are concerned, and this is also cited by a phenomenal book by Professor Ashwin Desai and Ghulam Fayed in their book called Inside Indenture. Here we have passenger number 122 on board the Mvoti in 1882. 16-year-old Munyama was recorded to have committed suicide on the official captain's logbook. Upon further investigation, and simply because of the testimony of a fellow passenger, in this case, Andy Sinan, it suggests that the sailors were actually responsible for Munyama's death in that she was thrown overboard. So Munyama's death on board the voyage of this particular voyage just highlights one case of the abuse of children during the voyages. Beyond the archives, and this is a sensational find, which we need to unpack in a more detailed paper, in a break from conventional agency and local archival material, Stuart Furburn of Sydney posted images on Facebook. And he had drawn this from the diaries and clippings of his grandfather, Max de Krutter. Max de Krutter had captained indenture ships for a number of years. And so his diary and the pictures that the grandson had posted that were in the possession of Max de Krutter starts giving us fresh insight into the events of these journeys. And in one particular diary entry, it talks to how children became part of the system. Here, where this is de Krutter's diary, he speaks about it also happened that children were born during the voyage of indenture. Each new arrival meant that there was an extra gratuity for the doctor, the master, the officers, the bonus being calculated on the number of souls landed and not embarked. Here, we just start seeing the commodification of children. This is this picture that, is sensational in terms of breaking with agency. It's an incredible picture because in South Africa, we don't have the individual photos of the 152,000 people between 1860 and 1911. That's lost somewhere, possibly in one of the museums. But this picture aboard this SS Umona in 1903, once we start looking at the ship's list, we start identifying, character traits that will be able to identify where certain people had come from and so on, grandmothers and grandfathers and so on. And this is the conditions in which people were brought over. So it's something that is unpublished and is very rare in terms of its find. Abuse on arrival. During the first phase of indenture to entail, colonial planters paid £7 per adult and £3, 10 shillings per child. On board the first ship, the Truro, there was this individual, 34-year-old Orquium, who was accompanied by her daughters, 8-year-old Migliama and Susanna. The names were very poorly spelled. So, this is from the official records, the ship's list. So you'll notice that because they were badly captured, they were badly recorded as well. But clearly, these weren't the full spellings of them. But in this particular case, this family, the mother and the 2 children, were assigned to Gray's Hospital to work. A year later, both children were assigned to different colonial employers. And in this instance, although the law prohibited the assignment of children under 10, clearly this wasn't the case. Sadly, the mother, Rokium, died 3 years later. What became of Migliama and Susanna, both orphaned at the age of 12, is consigned to history as yet another family wrecked by the system of indenture. This is the first cohort of the ship's analysis. And the reason for this is that it starts to show you and break down the child, and we define child here between the ages of 0 to 18. But this is the first cohort of the 15,000, and this is the first Excel spreadsheet that exists today. So between an infant age, there were 934. This is between 0 and 3. Preschool going children, 824. School going, 635. Teenagers, 1,205. And this equates to 24% of this first cohort. In the bigger paper, I'll present the whole lot of between the 152,000 that will give us numbers in terms of this particular breakdown. Archival complaints. Henry Pollock, close friend of Gandhi, was determined to expose the evil system of indenture. His only reference to child labor was in the tea factories, and this is where children were used extensively. They worked as much as 11 hours per week. The law laid down that women were to be paid half the wages and minors in proportion. A boy's wage could vary from 5 to 9 shillings per month, with an increase of 1 shilling per month per annum. Thus, a boy would receive 2 pennies for 9 hours of work per day. This is a very good example of children being involved in the system of indenture. Here we see children barely in their teens required to earn their keep on the Mount Edgecombe estates. The Mount Edgecombe estates is probably about 20 kilometers away from the city of Durban, and it's really the seat of indentured labor in South Africa. Boys here work the same hours as men, but for considerably lower wages. The Hewlett's factory out in northern Natal, close to Stanger and Kersney, were notorious for the use of children. And because of the tea plantations, they needed dexterity of small hands and nimble fingers, which were required for picking tea leaves. Younger children were also put to work in light factory tasks, such as sweeping and so on. Here are perfect examples of children heavily involved in the system of, or the mechanism of labor provision. A haunting picture of a young girl working in the Hewlett's plantations, tea plantations out in Stanger, the north of Durban. Oral interviews, and here I must pause to actually acknowledge the work of Professor Surendra Bana and Professor Uma Dupele Mestri. These were assignments done by students in the 1980s, and Professor Bana and Professor Uma Dupele Mestri, at that time she was a lecturer, they guided this particular project. So it provided phenomenal insight in terms of oral testimonies. In one particular case, this is a painful story of Parasuraman Ammavasai. Parasuraman arrived in 1907 with his parents as an infant, and he was accompanied by his 5-year-old sister. At the age of 12, Parasuraman started work as a field laborer. So by 12 years, children were fully involved in the system of labor provision, and he earned 2 shillings per month. The saddest part about Parasuraman and his life was that he worked for this company, the Reynolds brothers, who were the most unkind and where the most amount of abuse was committed in their plantations. He worked for them for 53 years. And according to the company, they didn't have any record of him. They proceeded to pay him 2 rand for every year of service. And sadly, he died with no income, no extra income, and he died really penniless in his estate down in the South Coast. Here we see children, and if you look to the bottom left-hand corner, children are firmly part of the system of indenture. And here, this is payday out in the Bria in 1900. Child neglect, and this is also quite horrendous cases as well. Here we witness to the tragic case of the Robinsons, and where they employed Mudali and his wife Oda Nagi. Their elder child was 2.5 years old and was tied to a peg the whole day while the children worked. When the second child was born to this couple, less than a week old, the employer allowed the mother to bring the child to work. Fearing that, well, the employer didn't allow. Fearing that the child would starve, the mother gave the child away to foster parents, and sadly, the child died of neglect. Education was something that was paltry for a number of years between 1869 and 1899. There was only primary school education being offered. The census of this census shows that there were 5% of Natal Indians who were literate in English. 29 predominantly missionary schools, and these were poorly resourced. At this time, most parents of school-going children could not afford to send their children to school, so children were contributing to the family upkeep. These were the lucky few that were able to go to school. And you also see a hierarchy in terms of the levels. You see some children with school, with shoes, and some without. So this was also an issue of contention in the earlier years as when education had started. Psychological trauma, and this is really something that we need to bring more to attention to. And perhaps the most extreme evidence of psychological trauma is the high suicide rates in the plantation. In reference to children, of that list, between 1880 and 1911, there were 14 children to have been listed. Of this figure, there were 5 18-year-olds, 3 17-year-olds. I can't see my screen, so let me just move that a bit. 2 were 16-year-olds, 2 were 13-year-olds, 1 was 12 years, and the youngest being 10.5-year-old. How a 10.5-year-old commits suicide is beyond me, but it's something that needs to be investigated in terms of the actual events around that. Excuse me. Just remind me of time as we go along. The sociological impact beyond indenture, and this is one of the focus of my paper that speaks to beyond indenture, how child labor continued. In this instance, children often accompanied parents to sell fresh produce, and not just in Durban, but in Johannesburg as well, where many of the hawkers and traders had settled. Here we see children also themselves would take to hawking small items and so on. Dry fish was the only source of protein rations during indenture. And in this small island in the Bay of Durban, which is called Salisbury, you see children that were high in number. So these were free Indians post-indenture. And in 1885, the total population was 218 free Indians, of this, there were 86 children that inhabited the land. So obviously there were more children than there were adults in this particular instance. And as you see with the pictures, they were clearly part of the working environment. Children were also involved in other employment beyond indenture. And when the contracts started to expire, they found their way towards the urban environments. And one of the employment opportunities, I won't call it an opportunity, but in this case here, it's an abuse, simply because of children, as you see with this picture, working in the hotel industry. And this is out in a tea room in Mitchell Park in the early 1900s. Missionary played an important part. Yes.
Pardon me, Selvin, we have 2 more minutes.
Okay, great. I should be able to finish off. So in terms of childcare and missionary was very important during the Gandhi years, and particularly at this time, there were missionaries that were really concerned with overcrowding, living conditions, high child and maternal mortality, and there were high incidence of disease and so on, and a widespread illiteracy, specifically among children. And there was sterling work that was done by the missionaries in being able to prevent high infant Indian death at this particular time. So they were trained midwives, in this case here we call them ayahs or bag ladies, and Sister Frances played an important role in the training. Here you see Sister Frances in the center. The missionary work that you see, an orphanage, as you see on the top left-hand corner. Social welfare, there were 2 institutes, namely the Arin Benevolent Home and the Durban Indian Child Welfare. They had to take care of children simply because children of color were denied by the borough of Durban and the government at that particular time. This is the Arin Benevolent Home. Years later, in 1933, they were formed in 1921, and this building doesn't exist any longer. They do exist now in Chatsworth. Milk, the provision of milk for nutrition towards the mid-century. Cape Town Agreement, I'll wrap up very quickly, which meant that there was poor education. There was a fight for secondary schools in 1941 by the Natal Indian Congress because of the poor resources with regard to education, children that were denied. This was a young child, but clearly had adult responsibilities, as you see with the dummy. This was a beautiful expose done in 1957, as late as that, and it was beautifully captured by Ranjit Kali. And here you see children younger than 10 years, in some instances, still working in the sugarcane plantations. Children preparing sugarcane. So, it still continued up to the 60s, obviously in smaller numbers. And in conclusion, I want to probably look at my last bullet because of time, but in rising to Professor Barner's challenge, as I pointed out earlier, there must be more research that's undertaken with regard to centralizing the Indian child migrant as a historical subject in its own right. Thank you for that, and apologies for going over time.
Thank you. So Selvan Naidu's presentation was not only disturbing, but also unique, if not rare, in this conference in terms of highlighting child labor and exploitation in indenture. And after your presentation, we realized that children are perhaps the forgotten or underappreciated victims of indenture. And as you say, definitely we need more research in this area. We can see South Africa, they are doing some work in this area, but I'm not too sure about the other countries. So thank you for that, Selvan.
Thank you so much.